Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to How Did They Stack Up series. Today we will be talking about Williams. Williams came in ninth in the constructor standings, so we'll be comparing that constructor against the other constructors around them. So that's Stake F1 and RB, as well as we're talking about the drivers for Williams and how they stood up against the drivers around them in the constructor standings. So we'll be comparing those. We will start looking at Williams, some stats that I've collected. And as you can see here, Williams came in the ninth. Their average starting position was 15, and their average finishing position was 14. So they were overall gained a position throughout the season in that Williams. But they didn't quite make it up to that, point scoring mark enough to put them higher in the constructor standings. They also had a whopping 13 DNFs. And of course, that's not crashes necessarily, but that's parts that didn't finish or something else that happened in the race that they could not finish the race. And so they had a whole 13 of those, and those get divided by against the three Williams drivers. So we start off with Logan Sargent, who is standing with 23rd position, not quite last, but pretty close to last. His average starting position was 17th, and his average finishing position was 17th. He had 3 DNFs out of those 13 for Williams. So kind of leading the back of the pack here for the Williams drivers. And then we have the tried and true Alex Albon, who was standing at 16th in the Drivers' Championship. His starting position was 13, and his average finishing position was 13. So good even score for him. Right at that back of the pack, really close to getting those points, but not quite at that mark most of the time. He had the majority of the DNFs with 7. Of course, that was him throughout the full season and not just part of the season like the other 2 drivers. And then we have the newcomer, Franco Colapinto, whose standing was 19th in the driver's standing at the end of the season. He started his position at 16 on average and finished in the 11th spot, and also had 3 DNFs. So we can see here that Franco started out farther behind, but was able to gain more positions in the race, more than his teammate, Alex, and definitely more than his old teammate, Logan, who he replaced. This is a comparison between the 3 Williams drivers on the sprint races. So we have Alex versus Logan versus Franco in this graph of these 6 sprint races. And you can see the finishing positions on the x-axis, so that's on the left, and the race on the bottom on the y-axis. So the trend lines that we have, the straight lines there, should be going down to get better and not up. So we can kind of see Logan Sargent getting better throughout the season. He only participated in 4 sprint races and did decently on one of those where the others were kind of lagging behind. So he's getting better overall, but not quite as well as he needed to. Now you compare that to Alex Albon, which was not doing quite as well in those sprint races. He was kind of lagging behind a little bit between Logan Sargent, but coming back strong at the end of the season. And then we have Franco, who only completed 2 sprint races, so his line there was kind of obscured because he only had 2 races, and so it looks like he is getting much worse in this trend line marker. Next, we will break down each driver and comparing it on their sprint races to the drivers around them in the Drivers' Championship. Here, Logan Sargent basically comparing himself against Valtteri Bottas. So we have Bottas getting worse throughout the season on the sprint races, where Logan Sargent was getting better. So he was slowly learning how to manipulate that Williams car throughout the season. Question is, did that show off in the GP races as well? We will have to wait and see later in this video. You can see Valtteri in green, starting off strong, having a pretty bad mid-season, and then coming back strong at the end when their Stake F1 car was starting to get back tweaked compared to the rest of the field. So I think that was the big takeaway here, not necessarily the driver's performance, but more of the team performance on the back end, where Stake was really struggling throughout this season compared to the rest of the teams in the field. Wasn't really able to gain ground until the very end of the season. We can look here at Alex Albon, who we compare against Daniel Ricciardo and Kevin Magnussen. So we have Alex in blue, Daniel in red, and Kevin in yellow. So as you can see here, Daniel participated in the first 3 races, and his trend line is pretty bad, starting off decently, but ending up worse. And so he's kind of going up, which is a bad thing. Finishing a little farther back in the pack the more the season went, where we have Kevin Magnussen and Alex Albon getting better, and we can also see Kevin actually doing better overall compared to Alex in his positions in these races, even though Kevin missed the Brazil sprint race. So we can kind of look at those and kind of compare and how they ended up overall in the ranking and compare it. And of course, this is just the sprint races. But we can kind of see the ups and down flow, which pertain probably more toward the vehicle characteristics for each of those races in comparison to the driver's skill level. And we'll kind of move on to Franco, who we're going to compare against Juan Zhou and Oliver Behrman. And Oliver Behrman only had 1 sprint race, and so he has a nice little dot at the Brazil marker. And then we have Franco Colapinto had the 2, so they had the Brazil and the Qatar race. And so his trend line is kind of going obscurely upwards, which is not good. But of course, you only have 2 races to compare to each other. That's probably not the greatest viewpoint on his trend line. Probably need to get a few more points to really see how his sprint race capability would be in these races to really give a good, true view of how he would do in a full season. But we can also compare Juan Zhou, who started off very strong in those sprint races, kind of dipped out in the middle section and was getting a little bit better, but not quite where he needed to be back at the beginning of this season. So if you compare the 3 and where their finishing positions were, you can see that Franco is actually doing better overall compared to the other 2, even though his trend line is kind of skewed in this ranking. So now we're looking at the GP races, and we can see Logan Sargent versus Alex Albon versus Franco Colapinto. So this is the Williams team members, comparing them to each other. And again, we have Logan in blue, Alex in red, and Franco Colapinto in yellow. So we can see breaks where they had all the DNFs. And so you had Logan Sargent lagging behind in that top part of this graph, not quite where it needs to be, closer to his teammate. And then you have Franco Colapinto coming in at the end of the season, doing closer to his teammate, but still on that bad trajectory near the end. So he was trying to push himself a little bit too far, I think, in the last few races, trying to really prove himself that he needed a ride in the 2025 season. And that was kind of hurting him overall. I think he was too young to try to really grasp and really keep calm in those situations and putting too much pressure on himself. And that didn't pay off as well as he would have liked near the end of the season. But you can see when he started off, he was doing fairly good, fairly comparatively to Alex Albon in those races, doing decently, keeping in that 10th place marker range, being able to get those points. So that's a really good marker and trend for him, even though his trend line is looking not as good as it should be. And then, of course, you can compare Alex Albon and Logan Sargent, who are pretty much on par with their trend lines getting better, so that you can kind of guess that that's the Williams team getting better throughout the season. But kind of comparing that gap between them, you can see how much better that Alex Albon is than Logan Sargent. And you can also see that why they decided to replace Logan with Franco Colapinto at the midpoint of the season and give Franco a chance to prove himself in that Williams vehicle. As he did much better and kind of wowed a lot of people in the paddock. You can kind of see the results between Logan Sargent and Franco and why they replaced Logan with Franco partway through this season. You can see that he did much better and it was more competitive with Alex Albon in those races, and kind of wowing some people in the paddocks to see, how well he was doing and potentially trying to gain a seat for this next year. Unfortunately, that didn't play out quite as well as I think he would have hoped, even though he is now a reserve driver for that Alpine, which potentially could get him a seat on the racetrack if he has to replace Jack Doohan for some reason. Jack is not doing well in this next season. He might get a chance to prove himself again in the full races to see if he can earn himself a seat on the 2025 grid. Now we can look at each of those Williams drivers and comparing them to each of the other people around him. So we have Logan Sargent versus Jack Doohan in his one race, and Valtteri Bottas, as his competitors around him in that drivers' championship. So you see Logan Sargent still lacking behind Valtteri Bottas throughout this, even though he is fairly close. And I think that's more comparatively to the difference in the F1 chassis in their vehicles than it was true driver skill level. You can kind of see that Valtteri, even in that weak Stake F1 car, kind of outdid Logan Sargent in most of the races and was pretty steady, whereas Logan Sargent kind of had a wild start of this race before he get closer to a good leveling mark. And then we have Jack Doohan in his one Abu Dhabi race that you can kind of compare, even though Logan Sargent wasn't there, and Valtteri had a DNF, I believe, and so he's not even ranked in this marker. But you can kind of see that closeness between Logan Sargent and Valtteri, so you can potentially think that they're decently comparative, but I think it was more compared to the vehicle standings, as Valtteri was able to get more out of the Stake F1, and Logan Sargent was kind of lacking in that Williams to push forward. Here we see Alex Albon versus Daniel Ricciardo versus Kevin Magnussen, and we see a much closer trend line comparison between these three drivers. So we have Alex in blue, Daniel in red, and Kevin Magnussen in yellow. And so basically we can see Alex Albon starting off roughly into that, that 14th position and slowly gaining a little bit of ground throughout the season, getting the most out of his Williams as that season went on, whereas Daniel Ricciardo was kind of a flat marker, but just ahead of him at the beginning and just behind him at the end. And Kevin Magnussen starting off worse, but getting better throughout the season, faster than Alex Albon. And you can kind of see where those end up in the championships, and especially in the constructors. So you can kind of have to factor that in to this graph and figuring out how well they compare skill level for each of these drivers. And you can kind of figure out as well how each track is compared to each of the other drivers, as they seem to have some bad instances for all three, whereas they kind of follow that same trend line for these back end cars. They kind of end up in that same pattern, which is kind of interesting to see that, even though you have some of those one-offs that kind of throw each of those drivers out of whack. And of course, we don't have a complete line for any of these drivers because we had DNFs or they didn't compete in those races, so you have those breaks in that full picture. But I didn't want to mark the DNFs in this graph because I didn't think that was a really good comparison. If they couldn't complete the race for whatever reason, it could have been up to them for why they didn't complete, or it could have been some other instance that someone else ended up breaking parts on their vehicle, causing them to not to finish the race either. So you have to kind of factor that in and you're looking. But overall, I think you can kind of tell the nice grouping between the three drivers. They're fairly close together on those trend lines, and you can pretty close together on their finishing positions as well. So here we can look at Franco versus Juan Yuzhou versus Behrman. And you have Franco Colapinto in blue, Juan Yuzhou in green, and Oliver Behrman in red. So we have a few races that Oliver Behrman was able to participate in. And then you have the back half that Franco joined the Williams team. And so you get those races at the end of the season, and you compare those against Juan Yuzhou's full season, but in that Stake F1 that was kind of lagging behind. You can maybe get a gauge on how they compare, even though that Stake F1 car lagged behind significantly. Juan Yuzhou wasn't able to pull up to the other two drivers around him in these races truly comparatively. So that's why he's kind of farther back behind that marker. Then you have Oliver Behrman in his Ferrari race at the beginning, and as Haas race at the end, kind of looking at those points of interest and how they played out to those drivers around him in his finishing position. So he's kind of in the middle of that pack between the two. And then, of course, you have Franco that was started off fairly good in this Williams, jumping in at the end of the season, being able to really pull what he could out of that Williams, even though it was getting worse throughout the season. I think he was trying to, as I said, put a little bit too much pressure, trying to figure out if he could get a seat for this next year, and putting too much pressure on himself. And so he's making some mistakes that cost him at the end of the season. So here we are looking at the Williams team versus the Stake team and the RB team. So we're looking at the constructor standing and where Williams ended up between RB and Stake. And this is the points that they gained for each team throughout the season. And you can kind of see those trend lines as well. So we have RB starting off really strong and getting weaker throughout the season, not be able to really keep up with the rest of the teams. Then you have Williams and Stake starting off poorly, but getting better throughout this season, and especially with Stake F1 only being able to gain points in Cutter. So they're kind of lacking behind all of those teams. But you can kind of figure out the markers or where the teams were good and where they were poor. And you see the RBs starting off strong and the Williams kind of getting a few points, in Monaco and Great Britain and Italy, but really putting the pressure on in Azerbaijan, and then kind of tailing off the season with a couple of points in Coda. Kind of marker there, trying to figure out how those teams kind of line up to each other throughout this season. Here we can just see the same thing, but in a step graph. So we can see, the Stake was really dead until we got to Cutter, and they kind of stepped up and got a few points. Whereas Williams started off pretty poorly, but finally got some points in Monaco and kind of slowly stepped up throughout a couple of those races, but gained most of their points in Azerbaijan, and then got a couple of extra points in the Circuit of the Americas there. So they weren't really competitive against the RB team, but they were definitely outshining the Stake F1 team, as you can see in the step graph for points throughout the season. Whereas RB kind of started off pretty strong, jumping up there and getting fairly good points, and then kind of leveling out to the middle season, and then gaining a few more points at the end. But they really wasn't close to the Williams team in that comparison, so they were not really having any kind of pressure from Williams in this constructor standings. So where does that leave us? The next team, which is RB, and how they stack up against the teams around them and the drivers around them. And of course, we have 3 drivers for RB this season as well. So we'll have to compare those drivers around the people in their drivers championship where they ended up in this season. So if you want to see this, I would appreciate a like and a follow. Until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.